The distress signal came through the cold emptiness of space, broken, desperate, and filled with fear. It wasn't meant for Earth. The Galactic Council had already written off the Zirath ship. To them, it was just another casualty in the Cinder Empire's relentless march. No one dared answer the call. No one wanted to risk their lives. But on Earth, deep inside a classified military outpost, the signal was picked up, and one man listened. Commander Jake Viper Lawson sat alone in the dim light of the control room, his eyes fixed on the screen as the alien message played on a loop. The language was unfamiliar, but the emotion behind it needed no translation. Fear, desperation, and the unmistakable sounds of battle. The comms were filled with screaming, explosions, and the crackle of a ship falling apart. Jake felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He knew what this meant. They were being hunted, and no one was coming to save them. "Sir, this isn't our fight," his wingman, Reyes, warned from behind him. "We've got strict orders not to engage in their war. Let the Council handle it." Jake didn't take his eyes off the screen. "The Council already decided they're not going to handle it." Reyes sighed. "Then maybe we shouldn't either." But Jake was already on his feet, his mind made up. "Suit yourself," he said, "but I'm not sitting back while people die." Minutes later, Jake was strapped into the cockpit of the Raptor X, Earth's most advanced experimental fighter. It was a sleek, deadly machine, equipped with cloaking technology, next-gen AI, and weapons so powerful they hadn't even been fully tested. It was a ship made for a pilot who wasn't afraid to push the limits. And Jake was exactly that kind of pilot. The launch bay doors opened. With a deafening roar, the Raptor X shot into the stars. When Jake arrived, the battlefield was a nightmare. The Zirath ship was spinning out of control, its hull covered in flames and debris. Swarms of cinder fighters circled it like vultures, raining down endless fire. The Zirath's defenses were barely holding. Their destruction was only moments away. Jake's heartbeat quickened. "Let's see how you handle something you can't see." He activated the cloaking device and dove into the fight. The Cinder never saw him coming. The first enemy fighter exploded before they even realized they were under attack. The second was gone in the blink of an eye. Jake's ship danced through the chaos, his weapons painting the void with fire and light. The Cinder formations broke apart, their pilots panicking. They didn't know what was hitting them. Inside the Zirath ship, the crew watched in stunned silence. Their screens showed Cinder ships exploding one after another, but they couldn't see their savior. Just destruction raining down on their enemies. On the bridge, Commander Relana's violet eyes narrowed. "What is that?" she whispered. But the fight wasn't over. A massive shadow loomed over the battlefield. The Cinder capital ship, its cannons already charging. Jake saw it too, and he knew their time was running out. He pushed his ship to its limits, taking out as many fighters as he could. But there were too many, and the capital ship was closing in. "Hang on," he muttered. "I'm coming." Jake's fighter docked in the Zirath's hangar, and he stepped out to a less than warm welcome. Zirath soldiers surrounded him immediately, their weapons trained on him. "Stand down," a sharp voice commanded. Commander Relana pushed through the crowd, her silver hair streaked with blood and soot. Her feline features were fierce, and her eyes locked onto Jake with suspicion. "You saved us," she said slowly, her voice cool and controlled. "But humans don't fight our battles. Why are you here?" Jake shrugged. "Because no one else came." Before she could respond, alarms blared through the ship. The Cinder capital ship was in firing range. Jake glanced at her. "You want to argue, or you want to survive?" For the first time, Relana smiled. It was a dangerous smile. "Let's survive." The Cinder launched boarding pods, and the ship's corridors erupted into chaos. Jake fought alongside the Zirath, his movements swift and brutal. He wasn't just a pilot. He was a soldier. And the Zirath noticed. Jake's fists broke bones. His blaster never missed, And when the cinder targeted the ship's wounded, his fury was unstoppable. "No one gets left behind," he growled, cutting down the enemy without mercy. Raylana fought beside him, and their rhythm was perfect. In the heat of battle, a silent understanding passed between them. But it wasn't enough. The Zirath ship was falling apart. Their engines were failing. And the Cinder capital ship was preparing a final devastating attack. "We won't make it," Raylana said quietly. "Not without a miracle." Jake looked at the Raptor X. "I'll give you one." Before she could stop him, he was already in the cockpit, launching toward the enemy. The Cinder capital ship unleashed its firepower, but Jake was faster. His ship twisted and spun, dodging death with every move. He targeted their weapons, their engines, their bridge, hitting them where it hurt. But the Cinder were relentless. A lucky shot slammed into the Raptor X, sending it spinning. Jake fought for control, blood running down his face. He was out of options. "Jake." Raylana's voice crackled through the comms. "Get out of there." He didn't. Instead, he armed his last missile and aimed directly at the capital ship's core. "This one's for you," he whispered. At the last second, the Zirath ship surged forward, their remaining weapons firing with everything they had. Raylana's voice roared through the comms, a warrior's cry. The Cinder capital ship began to crumble. Jake fired his missile. The explosion lit up the darkness of space, and the Cinder flagship was no more. But the blast wave caught the Raptor X, sending it hurtling into the void. Raylana's scream echoed through the comms as his signal went dark. The Zirath limped away from the battlefield, their ship barely holding together. The crew mourned their losses and the human who had saved them all. But in the silence, a weak signal crackled through. "Did I miss the celebration?" Jake's voice was rough, but alive. The cheers were deafening. Later, as they prepared for his return to Earth, Raylana approached him. "You're reckless, arrogant, and the bravest being I've ever met," she said quietly. "The Zirath owe you everything." Jake grinned. "Just doing my job." But as their ships parted ways, Raylana's eyes stayed on him. And the Zirath whispered his name, the human who had answered their call when no one else would. A legend had been born. The hangar was filled with the sound of alarms and the scent of burning metal. The Zirath ship was on the brink of collapse, and the air itself felt heavy with fear and desperation. Jake stepped out of his fighter, the Raptor X, his boots hitting the deck with a solid thud. Around him, alien soldiers aimed their weapons, their eyes filled with suspicion and confusion. He didn't flinch. He raised his hands slowly, his voice calm. "I'm here to help." The soldiers didn't lower their weapons. They didn't trust him. And Jake didn't blame them. Humanity wasn't exactly known for jumping into alien wars, and he was well aware of the rumors about humans being violent, unpredictable, dangerous. Right now, those rumors were working against him. "Stand down." A commanding voice cut through the tension. Jake turned toward the sound and saw her, Commander Raylana. She walked toward him with a warrior's grace, her silver hair streaked with soot and her violet eyes locked onto him. Her face was fierce, her feline-like features sharp and beautiful. But it was her presence that stood out the most. She radiated authority and strength, and the soldiers obeyed her without question. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice cool and controlled. "Commander Jake Lawson, Earth Defense Force," he answered. "Call sign: Viper." Her eyes narrowed. "Earth doesn't interfere in our wars." "Maybe Earth doesn't," Jake said, his voice steady. "But I do." Before she could respond, the ship shuddered violently. The sound of distant explosions echoed through the hangar. A voice crackled over the comms, speaking in a language Jake didn't understand, but the urgency was clear. "We don't have time for this," Raylana snapped. "Follow me." Jake didn't hesitate. He fell in step beside her, moving through the damaged corridors of the ship. Fires raged, the walls shook, and the air was filled with the cries of the wounded. He could see the fear in the eyes of the Zerath crew. They knew their ship wouldn't last much longer. "What's the situation?" Jake asked as they reached the bridge. "The Sindar have us pinned," Rylana said, her voice tight. "Their capital ship is preparing a final strike. Our engines are failing, and our weapons are down to 30% capacity. We won't survive another attack." Jake's eyes flicked to the screen. Outside, the Cinder ships circled like predators, and the massive capital ship loomed closer. He clenched his jaw. They were outnumbered and outgunned, and he loved those odds. "I can take out their weapon systems," he said. Rylana's eyes snapped to him. "Alone? That's suicide." "Maybe," Jake said with a shrug. "But I'm good at impossible missions." The ship shuddered again, and the lights flickered. Time was running out. "Get me close to that capital ship," Jake said. "I'll handle the rest." For a moment, Rylana just stared at him. Then she nodded. "You're insane." "Yeah," Jake said with a grin. "But it's a good kind of insane." The Raptor X roared out of the hangar, cloaking immediately as Jake pushed it to its limits. The Cinder never saw him coming. He weaved through their fighters, his weapons blazing. Ships exploded around him, but he didn't slow down. He had one target in mind, the capital ship. Inside the Zerath ship, Rylana watched the battle unfold, her breath catching every time his ship flickered on their sensors. He was fast, faster than anything she'd ever seen. And he was relentless. But the Cinder weren't going down without a fight. A lucky shot clipped the Raptor X, and Jake's console sparked. He gritted his teeth, fighting for control. The capital ship's main cannon was charging, and he knew he had only one shot. "Come on," he muttered. "Just a little closer." He fired his last missile, aiming straight for the cannon's core. The explosion ripped through the capital ship, and the weapon went dark. But the blast wave caught the Raptor X, sending it spinning into the void. "Jake." Rylana's voice cracked over the comms. "Jake, respond." Static answered her. On the bridge of the Zerath ship, silence fell. The Cinder ships began to retreat, but there was no celebration. Their savior was gone. And then, through the static, a weak voice broke through. "Did I miss the celebration?" The cheers were deafening. Later, as the Zerath ship limped away from the battlefield, Rylana found Jake in the med bay, battered but alive. She stood at his bedside, her eyes softer than before. "You're reckless," she said quietly. "Arrogant. Impossible." Jake grinned, "But effective." She didn't smile. "You saved us." Her voice softened. "Thank you." Jake met her gaze. "Anytime." As their ships prepared to part ways, Rylana watched him go, and she knew this wasn't the last time their paths would cross. The human who had answered their call when no one else would have become a legend. The walls shook with every impact. The Zerath ship was barely holding together, and the sound of distant explosions echoed through the corridors like a drumbeat of doom. Jake Lawson moved with quick, determined strides, his eyes scanning every shadow. He knew they weren't alone. The Cinder had boarded. He could feel it. The tension in the air, the way the Zerath soldiers around him gripped their weapons tighter with every step. Even Rylana, the fierce and commanding leader of the alien crew, had a sharpness to her that hadn't been there before. She walked ahead of him, her long silver hair trailing behind her like a banner, her violet eyes cold and focused. "Where's your armory?" Jake asked, his voice low. "Close," Rylana replied without looking back. "We need to rearm before we engage." But they never got the chance. The attack came fast and brutal. The corridor exploded in gunfire, Cinder soldiers pouring out of side passages with terrifying speed. Jake dove for cover behind a bulkhead, his pulse pounding. The Cinder were tall and armored, their sleek black exosuits giving them an insect-like appearance. Their weapons spat blue energy, scorching the walls and sending Zerath soldiers scrambling. Jake didn't wait. He popped out from cover and fired, his sidearm barking 3 times. A Cinder soldier dropped, and then another, but there were too many. Fall back. Rylana's voice cut through the chaos. Jake moved, covering the retreat with precise, controlled bursts of fire. The Zirath soldiers followed her orders without hesitation, but they were getting cut down. A soldier fell beside Jake, and he grabbed the alien's rifle without missing a beat. "Go," he shouted. Rylana hesitated, her eyes flicking to him. But there was no time for argument. She led her remaining troops down a side corridor, and Jake stayed behind, his back against the wall. The Cinder advanced, their weapons relentless. "All right," Jake muttered, checking the rifle's charge. "Let's see how tough you really are." He stepped out and unleashed hell. The rifle kicked hard against his shoulder, and Cinder soldiers fell in rapid succession. But they kept coming. Jake moved fast, using the narrow corridor to his advantage, keeping them bottlenecked. He fought like a man possessed, every shot precise, every movement efficient. But even he couldn't hold them forever. A blast caught him in the side, and pain flared through his ribs. Jake stumbled, his vision swimming. The Cinder closed in, their weapons raised, and then the ceiling exploded. Rylana dropped down from a maintenance hatch, her twin blades flashing. She moved like lightning, cutting through the enemy with terrifying grace. The remaining Zirath soldiers followed, their sudden ambush turning the tide. When the last Cinder fell, Jake slumped against the wall, breathing hard. Rylana knelt beside him, her eyes sharp with worry. "You're hurt," she said. "I'll live," Jake managed. "But next time, maybe warn me before you blow the ceiling." A hint of a smile tugged at her lips. Noted. They didn't have time to rest. The Cinder might have been pushed back, but they weren't defeated, and Jake knew the worst was yet to come. "Let's move," Rylana said, helping him to his feet. "We need to get to the bridge." As they ran through the battered corridors, Jake glanced at her. "You always fight like that." She didn't look at him. "Only when my people are in danger." Jake smiled. "Good, because I think we're going to need that." The battle wasn't over, not by a long shot, and if they were going to survive, they'd have to fight together. The battle on the Zirath ship had taken its toll. The air was thick with the smell of burning metal and blood. The sound of distant explosions had quieted, replaced by the eerie silence of a battlefield after the fighting stops. But Jake Lawson knew better than to think it was over. Battles like this always came with a price, and that price was rarely paid in silence. He walked down the corridor, his steps heavy. The ship was barely holding together, its lights flickering and walls scorched. Zirath soldiers moved around him, their faces pale and their eyes filled with the weight of what they'd lost. They'd pushed the Cinder back, but victory had come at a terrible cost. Rylana stood ahead of him, her shoulders tense and her face unreadable. She was staring at a group of soldiers tending to the wounded. Jake could see it in her, the pain she was trying so hard to hide. "How bad is it?" Jake asked, his voice quiet. She didn't look at him. "Too many dead. Too many wounded." Her voice was steady, but he could hear the crack beneath it. "We barely survived." Jake glanced around. The Zirath crew had fought bravely, but they'd been outmatched from the start. Without his help, they wouldn't have made it this far. But even with him, the cost had been high. "We're not done yet," he said softly. "The Cinder aren't going to just walk away." Rylana finally turned to face him, her violet eyes fierce. "We don't have enough soldiers left to fight them off." "Then we hit them first," Jake said simply. "Hard and fast. Before they get the chance." She stared at him for a long moment. "You really are reckless." He grinned. "It's worked so far." But the truth was, even Jake knew their chances were slim. The Cinder capital ship was still out there, and the Zirath ship was hanging on by a thread. They needed a miracle, and Jake wasn't sure he had one left in him. They reached the bridge, and the damage was even worse there. Consoles sparked, and the crew worked frantically to keep the systems online. The captain's chair was empty. The Zirath commander who had once occupied it lay among the dead. Raylana took her place at the helm without hesitation. Status report. Engines at 15%, one of the officers said. Weapons offline. Shields failing. Jake whistled low. Well, that's not good. Enemy ship approaching, another officer added. They're charging weapons. Raylana's jaw tightened. We won't survive another attack. Jake looked at the screen, his mind racing. The Cinder capital ship was a monster, bristling with weapons, and twice the size of the Zirath vessel. But size didn't always win a fight. I'll go, Jake said suddenly. Raylana's head snapped toward him. What? I'll take the Raptor X and hit them from the inside, he said. Their defenses are strong, but if I can get close enough, you'll be killed, she cut him off. Maybe, Jake admitted. But if I don't, we're all dead anyway. The ship shuddered under another hit. Time was running out. Raylana stared at him, and for the first time, the mask slipped. He saw the fear in her eyes, not for herself, but for her people, for him. Jake. He smiled, trying to lighten the moment. Hey, I've done dumber things. It didn't work. She stepped closer, her voice low. You don't have to do this alone. Yes, I do, he said gently, because you're the one who's going to keep them together when I'm gone. The words hung between them, heavy and unspoken. She didn't argue. She just nodded. Good luck, Viper. He touched her shoulder briefly. See you on the other side. The launch bay was a mess, but the Raptor X was still intact. Jake climbed into the cockpit, the familiar hum of the engines like an old friend. As the hangar doors opened, he took one last look at the ship behind him, at the people he was fighting for. And then he was gone. The Cinder didn't see him coming. The Raptor X weaved through the enemy fighters like a shadow, its cloaking device holding just long enough for him to reach the capital ship. He hit the afterburners, diving straight toward the massive vessel. Come on, he muttered. Just a little closer. The capital ship's defenses finally caught on, but it was too late. Jake fired everything he had. Missiles, cannons, the works. Explosions rippled across the enemy hull, and then he was inside, skimming through the narrow corridors of the ship's structure. But the Cinder weren't going down without a fight. A lucky shot clipped his wing, and alarms screamed through the cockpit. Jake fought for control, but the damage was done. The Raptor X slammed into the Cinder's reactor core. The explosion was immediate and devastating. On the Zirath bridge, Raylana watched in horror as the enemy capital ship erupted in flames. Cheers broke out around her, but she couldn't move. Jake, she whispered. There was no answer. The battle was over. The Zirath had won, but the price of victory was more than she'd ever been prepared to pay. The Cinder capital ship burned in the darkness of space, its massive hull cracking apart, sending debris spinning into the void. The explosion was still fresh, a violent burst of light and fire, and the Zirath ship floated nearby, battered, broken, but still standing. The bridge was filled with stunned silence as the crew stared at the screen. They had won, but the cost of that victory was still unknown. Raylana stood frozen, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. The cheers that had erupted moments before had faded, and now only a heavy stillness remained. Her eyes were locked on the burning remains of the enemy ship and the place where Jake Lawson's fighter had gone in. Scan for life signs, she ordered, her voice tight. The crew scrambled to obey, but the readings were chaotic. The Cinder ship's destruction had flooded the area with radiation and interference, making it nearly impossible to pick up anything. Nothing yet, one of the officers said quietly. Raylana's jaw tightened. She refused to accept that. Jake wasn't the kind of man who went down without a fight, and she wasn't about to believe he was gone, not until she had proof. Keep looking, she said, her voice low but firm. I don't care how long it takes. The Zirath ship shuddered again, sparks flying from damaged consoles. They couldn't take much more of this. But Rylana didn't care. The battle might have been over, but her fight wasn't. Minutes passed like hours, and the silence grew heavier with every second. And then, wait. The officer at the sensor station sat up straight, his eyes wide. I'm picking up something. Rylana's heart leaped into her throat. Is it him? I think so. It's weak, but there's a life sign. Lock onto it and prepare for retrieval, she snapped. The crew moved fast, and moments later, the hangar bay was a flurry of activity. Medics stood ready as the rescue team brought in the battered escape pod they'd found drifting among the wreckage. The hull was scorched and dented, barely holding together. Rylana pushed through the crowd, her pulse pounding in her ears. The pod's hatch hissed as it opened, and her breath caught when she saw the figure inside. Jake Lawson slumped forward, his flight suit torn and bloodied. His face was pale, his breathing shallow, but he was alive. Get him to the med bay, Rylana ordered, her voice breaking. The medics worked quickly, lifting him onto a stretcher and rushing him away. Rylana followed, her mind a storm of emotions. Relief, fear, hope. Jake had risked everything to save them, and she wasn't about to let him die now. Hours passed before the doctors finally let her in. Jake lay on the bed, pale and still, but the steady beep of the monitors told her he was alive. She sank into the chair beside him, exhaustion washing over her. You really are reckless, she whispered, her fingers brushing his hand. His hand twitched beneath hers, and his eyes fluttered open. Hey, he rasped, his voice weak but unmistakably Jake. Told you, I had a plan. Rylana laughed, the sound half a sob. You idiot. Worked, didn't it? He said with a faint grin. She shook her head, tears prickling at the corners of her eyes. You almost died. Yeah, but I didn't. His voice softened. You okay? Rylana nodded, swallowing hard. We won. Thanks to you. Team effort, he murmured, his eyelids drooping. Couldn't have done it without you. He was asleep again before she could respond, his hand still resting in hers. But the weight on her chest finally eased. They had survived. And maybe, just maybe, they'd get their chance to see what came next. The Zeraf ship drifted through the aftermath of the battle, its once proud frame now a battered wreck. The crew moved through the corridors in silence, their faces heavy with exhaustion and grief. The battle had been won, but the cost had been staggering. Their dead were too many, and among them, they believed, was the human who had saved them all. In the dim light of the bridge, Rylana stood motionless, her eyes locked on the empty void beyond the viewing screen. The debris of the cinder capital ship floated like broken bones, a grim reminder of the fight they had just survived. The flickering light from dying fires cast long shadows, and the silence felt heavier than any explosion. She hadn't spoken since they'd lost Jake's signal. Her crew kept their distance, giving her space, but the weight of their unasked questions hung in the air. The human fighter pilot had been their savior, reckless, fearless, brilliant. And now he was gone. A soft crackle broke the silence. It was faint at first, almost lost in the ambient hum of the damaged systems. But then it came again, clearer this time. A voice, weak and rough but unmistakable. Did I miss the celebration? For a heartbeat, no one moved. And then the bridge erupted in chaos. Cheers and shouts filled the air, and Rylana's breath caught in her throat. Jake, she whispered, her voice shaking. Yeah, still here, he said, the humor in his voice barely masking his exhaustion. But someone's gonna have to pick me up. My ride's a little busted. The crew scrambled, tracking his signal and moving into action. Rylana didn't wait. She was already heading for the hangar, her heart pounding in her chest. When the battered escape pod was finally brought in, she was there to meet it. The hatch hissed open, and Jake slumped forward, his flight suit torn and streaked with blood. But his eyes found hers, and that familiar crooked grin tugged at his lips. Hey, he rasped. Miss me? Idiot. She choked out, but the relief flooding through her made the word almost gentle. The medics moved in, but even as they worked, Jake's eyes never left hers, and for the first time since the battle had begun, Raylana felt hope. The days that followed were a blur of repairs and recovery. The Zirath ship limped through space, held together by sheer will and what little engineering they could manage. But the mood had shifted. The despair that had weighed them down had been replaced with something else, a quiet reverence for the human who had fought and bled alongside them. Jake's injuries were severe, but he recovered quickly. Too quickly, if you asked the medics, but the man seemed incapable of staying still. Raylana found him in the observation deck one evening, watching the stars with a distant look in his eyes. "You should be resting," she said softly, stepping up beside him. "Yeah, well, never been good at that," he replied with a shrug. "Besides, hard to rest when there's so much to think about." She studied him for a moment, the way the starlight caught the lines of his face. "We owe you our lives, you know." "Just doing my job," he said, but there was no bravado in his voice, only quiet sincerity. Raylana hesitated. "When this is over, when you go back to Earth, will you tell them about us?" Jake turned to her, his eyes softening. "I'll tell them about the bravest crew I have ever fought beside. About a captain who never gave up. And yeah, I'll tell them about you." Her breath caught, but before she could respond, the comms crackled with a new message. Earth's fleet had arrived, and it was time for Jake to go home. The departure was swift and efficient, but as their ships parted ways, the Zirath crew gathered to watch, and long after the human vessel had vanished into the stars, their whispers remained. They spoke his name with awe and gratitude. The human who had answered their call when no one else would. A legend had been born.